The wind arrived before the rain. Roofs tore loose across the island. By nightfall, Galveston had nowhere left to stand. On the morning of September 7th, 1900, the Gulf of Mexico shimmered under a sky of delicate blue. At the edge of that water lay Galveston, Texas, an island city barely 9 feet above the sea, proud and unbothered by what the ocean could bring. At the turn of the century, Galveston was called the Jewel of the Gulf. Its bustling harbor welcomed ships from Cuba, New Orleans, even far-off Europe. Cotton merchants hurried along the wharves. Horse-drawn carriages rattled down the Strand, the city's main avenue lined with banks, grand hotels, and gas-lit street lamps that glowed soft gold after sunset. The city felt modern, confident. The Beach Hotel, a vast wooden palace perched on the shoreline, hosted summer concerts where a seaside breeze fluttered women's parasols. Children waded in the shallow surf, while fathers smoked cigars beneath striped tents. Locals believed their island was blessed, too shallow for dangerous storm surges, too far from the open ocean to be truly threatened. The tallest buildings stood scarcely 4 stories, and no one dreamed of seawalls higher than a man's chest. But in the warmth of that September morning, the first warnings were already riding on the wind. Out in the Caribbean, a mass of swirling clouds had gathered days earlier. It had swept over Cuba, where seasoned weather observers pleaded that a powerful hurricane was headed northwest. Their messages, however, were dismissed by U.S. Weather Bureau officials who distrusted Cuban forecasts. The storm was real, but its voice was ignored. On the island itself, few residents noticed the subtle drop of the barometer. A seasoned observer might have seen how the breeze, usually steady from the south, shifted oddly to the northeast. But to most Galvestonians, the day remained bright and promising. Fishermen hauled nets ashore, shopkeepers opened their shutters, and a September weekend of business and leisure rolled forward without hesitation. Unseen beneath the calm, the Gulf waters began to breathe heavier swells toward the coast. The seagulls that often wheeled overhead grew restless, dipping low over the waves as if pulled by an instinct the townspeople could not share. From the wide verandas of the grand hotels, no one guessed that this very sea, so glittering and inviting, was gathering the strength to rise against them. It would take less than 48 hours for the Jewel of the Gulf to confront its darkest hour. At the dawn of the new century, Galveston was not merely a port, it was the cultural heart of Texas's coast. With a population nearing 38,000, the island had grown wealthy from cotton exports, its harbor second only to New Orleans in trade along the Gulf. Stately Victorian houses rose along tree-lined avenues. Churches with bell towers cast long morning shadows across red brick streets, and the city's opera house drew traveling performers from the East Coast. Prosperity bred a particular kind of faith in progress. Residents took pride in their electric streetcars and telephone lines, proof that Galveston had entered the modern age. Most saw little reason to fear the water that shimmered so peacefully at the city's doorstep. Hurricanes had visited Texas before, but none had struck Galveston with serious force since the island's founding. That calm history, combined with a culture of commerce and optimism, left people convinced that nature's wrath belonged to other shores. Some engineers had once suggested a seawall after a hurricane devastated Indianola, another Texas port, in the 1880s. But Galveston's civic leaders had dismissed the idea as unnecessary and too costly. "The Gulf will always protect her own," a local newspaper boasted years earlier. It was a sentiment echoed in parlors and city hall debates alike. By September of 1900, late summer brought tourists in their Sunday best to stroll the long wooden piers. Children dangled fishing lines into calm surf. Ice cream vendors rang brass bells along the beach promenade. The island seemed like a self-contained world of gentle tides and endless blue skies. Among the people who called this place home was Isaac Klein, the resident meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau. A man devoted to science and method, he believed Galveston stood little risk of hurricane disaster. His own conviction, born of years of study and the island's benign history, mirrored the confidence of the townspeople he served. Yet that certainty would soon weigh on him as a tragic burden. In the days before the storm, the breeze had taken on a strange weight. Longshoremen noted choppier waters lapping higher at the docks, but the warning signs failed to spark real alarm. Farmers crossing the wooden bridges from the mainland still drove wagons heavy with produce toward the markets. The daily newspaper carried only brief notes of a tropical disturbance somewhere in the Gulf, hardly the stuff to unsettle a thriving city preparing for its weekend routines. It is often said that disaster feels distant until the very hour it arrives. On that island in early September, life carried on in the bright illusion of safety. Merchants tallying their ledgers, the beach hotel orchestra tuning instruments for the evening's dance, families planning Sunday picnics beneath the live oaks. The Gulf breeze that rustled lace curtains that Friday night was already touched by the outer breath of the hurricane, but no one yet believed the sea itself would soon invade their streets.
By dawn on Saturday, September 8th, the island awoke beneath a sky that looked neither bright nor threatening, merely heavy, as if a veil of dull gray had been drawn over the horizon. The barometer at the U.S. Weather Bureau office on Rosenberg Avenue had slipped lower overnight. Isaac Klein tapped the glass and noted the figures again, uneasy at the steady decline. For days, Cuban meteorologists had been warning of a major hurricane spinning out of the Caribbean, but in Washington, the Weather Bureau's senior officials distrusted Cuban reports. Their official bulletins described it only as a tropical disturbance moving northeast, far from Texas. This contradiction left local observers like Klein to weigh their own instincts against distant orders. Walking the streets that morning, Klein noticed whitecaps forming closer to shore than usual and a strange, persistent wind from the northeast instead of the typical southerly breeze. He also saw families on the beach letting children wade into the surf, unaware of the swelling tide. In his journal, he later described the Gulf as restless, with a long rolling swell from the southeast. Old fishermen along the wharf exchanged worried looks. They spoke quietly of seabirds that had disappeared inland 2 days earlier, a sign they trusted more than any printed bulletin. The tide kept creeping up, licking over the edges of boardwalks. Wagon drivers splashed through salt water already pooling where dry streets should have been. At mid-morning, low, dark clouds began sliding fast across the sky, torn like ragged sails. A humid stillness settled over the city between gusts. Some merchants hammered shutters over their windows, more to shield against flying debris than out of any deep fear. Others continued business as usual. The Strand's storefronts bustled with customers buying provisions for the weekend, as if the strange weather were merely an inconvenience. Klein's younger brother Joseph, also employed at the Weather Bureau station, urged residents to be cautious and move belongings to upper floors. Few heeded the advice. Many islanders believed hurricanes were things that happened to Indianola, to New Orleans, anywhere but Galveston. Around noon, the rising water forced a few residents near the beach to abandon ground-level parlors and retreat upstairs. Telegraph operators at the Bureau tapped out urgent messages reporting the water level and wind speed, but lines to the mainland began to flicker with static. By early afternoon, the Gulf's waves slapped high against the wooden piers, shaking the pilings. Sheets of rain began to blow in sideways, needling the skin of anyone caught outside. Horses pulling carriages lowered their heads against the gusts. Still, many islanders lingered on porches, confident that the weather would pass by evening. The true hurricane, its core of fierce winds and surging tides, was still hours away from landfall, yet already the sea was at the city's doorstep, knocking in slow, deliberate pulses. By mid-afternoon on September 8th, the first real force of the hurricane revealed itself. Wind gusts rattled shutters like drums, tearing shingles from rooftops. The ocean, driven by the storm's deep breath, rose steadily over the sandbars and broke across the beach in thick, foaming walls. Salt spray drifted as far as the downtown district, coating shop windows in a mist that tasted of the open Gulf. Isaac Klein left the Weather Bureau office to survey the waterfront and was stunned to see tidewater already several feet above normal, flowing across roads like a slow-moving river. Telegraph lines crackled with static, and messages to the mainland grew garbled, then went silent. By 4 o'clock, the bridges that linked Galveston Island to Texas were in danger of submersion. The island was effectively cut off, alone before the approaching eye of the storm. Throughout the afternoon, the wind climbed in steady, punishing steps, 40, 50, then over 80 miles per hour. Wooden porches splintered, tin roofs peeled away and cartwheeled down avenues. The long pleasure pier that had hosted summer dances just weeks earlier shuddered under the pounding surf. Families retreated to upper floors of their houses, carrying oil lamps, quilts, and prayer books. The sound outside was unlike ordinary thunderstorm winds. It was a low, unbroken roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. Klein later wrote that the city quivered as though beneath the tread of 1,000 heavy engines. As dusk fell, heavy rain arrived in slanting sheets. The water in the streets merged with the rising tide until carriage horses waded chest-deep, unable to move. By nightfall, the entire southern half of the city lay under water. Furniture floated through parlors, barrels and debris bumped along the currents that once were streets. The storm surge reached nearly 15 feet, more than enough to sweep away the modest 1- and 2-story homes built close to the beach. Near the Ursuline Convent and the St. Mary's Orphans' Home, nuns tied ropes around their waists to keep the children together as water crept up the stairwells. Neighbors pounded on each other's doors, seeking refuge in sturdier houses. Some families gathered 20 or 30 souls under a single roof, hoping the combined weight of so many would keep the structure anchored. Others fled to the Grand Tremont Hotel or the brick-walled Moody Mansion, believing the solid masonry might endure. Outside, the city darkened as gas lamps blew out and power lines fell. Only flashes of blue lightning and the bobbing glow of lanterns inside upper windows gave any sense of where homes still stood. Near midnight, the storm reached its furious peak. Winds above 100 miles per hour screamed through the avenues, ripping entire walls from wooden houses and hurling them down the flooded streets like battering rams. Waves surged past the second stories of seaside buildings. People clung to rafters or crouched on rooftops as the current tore away staircases beneath them. Eyewitnesses later recalled hearing the steady thud of floating debris striking walls, timbers, doors, even uprooted trees smashing again and again against the sides of houses. From somewhere out in the black water came the mournful clang of a drifting ship's bell.
Those who survived described the night as endless. The roar of the wind drowned every human cry. Rain slashed at faces, blinding those who tried to navigate the rising water. A few who attempted to wade toward higher ground were swept off their feet and vanished in the flood. In one home after another, people formed human chains to keep from being carried away. Mothers wrapped their children in quilts and prayed above the noise, their words snatched away by the gale. Shortly after 2 a.m., the barometer in the Bureau's office recorded its lowest pressure before the instrument itself was torn loose by the wind. By then, most of the city lay submerged beneath swirling brown water choked with wreckage. Toward the darkest hour before dawn, as the hurricane's eye passed just offshore, there was no more distinction between sea and land, only a vast, heaving expanse of water under a screaming sky. When the first pale light crept across the horizon on September 9th, the storm's roar had faded to a hollow moan. The wind slackened to ragged gusts, but the sea still churned angrily against the shattered shoreline. As the sky brightened, survivors emerged from attics and rooftops, blinking in disbelief at what lay before them. Entire neighborhoods south of Broadway Street had been swept clean of houses, leaving only the pilings where porches once stood. The beach hotel, the island's pride of summer leisure, was reduced to a jagged skeleton of timber leaning toward the Gulf. Boats and small schooners lay marooned blocks inland, their keels resting absurdly against splintered fences. The stench of brine, mud, and soaked lumber filled the air. Everywhere floated broken furniture, rocking chairs, wardrobes split open with their contents spilling into the streets like the belongings of a shipwreck. Isaac Klein, exhausted from a night of rescue efforts, described the city as a wilderness of wreckage. He and other survivors began pulling neighbors from the debris, sometimes finding them clinging to beams, sometimes finding only silence beneath the rubble. Near the site of St. Mary's Orphans' Home, searchers found only fragments of the building's walls and scattered bits of rope where the nuns had tried to keep the children together. It was a scene that left even hardened rescuers weeping in the morning light. Along the Strand, brick buildings that had resisted the wind still stood, but bore scars of the flood. Lower floors gutted by water, windows blown out, merchandise strewn across streets coated with a thick layer of sand. Telegraph poles leaned at crooked angles like snapped matchsticks. Teams of men began to gather the injured on makeshift stretchers, doors torn from their hinges, sections of shutters bound with rope, and carried them to the few intact public buildings that could serve as infirmaries. Doctors worked without rest, sometimes with no more than lamp oil and strips of cloth to dress wounds. Survivors who had lost their homes wandered in shock, some barefoot, some carrying soaked family Bibles or portraits rescued from the flood. Stories began to pass from one group to another: a mother who had clung to a floating wardrobe through the night, a shopkeeper who sheltered 20 strangers in his upstairs storeroom, a boy who led his younger sister to safety by following the faint glow of lanterns bobbing across the water. The death toll was impossible to count that first day. Bodies lay tangled in piles of driftwood or buried under the wreckage of collapsed houses. Volunteers dug shallow trenches in the sand at first, but soon the numbers overwhelmed them. In the oppressive September heat, the risk of disease forced city officials to organize mass burials at sea. Despite the loss and ruin, small acts of humanity shone in the gloom. Neighbors who had been strangers before the storm shared bread and blankets. Women boiled seawater to wash wounds. Men formed bucket brigades to douse smoldering embers that threatened to ignite the debris. That Sunday evening, as the sun dipped behind the flattened spy-line, a hush settled over the island, broken only by the distant creak of a drifting boat against a shattered pier. More than 8,000 people were gone, nearly 1 in every 5 residents, yet those who remained began already to speak of rebuilding. Under the bruised purple twilight, the waves lapped gently at the same shore that had, only the night before, risen to swallow the city. It seemed impossible that such quiet water could have carried so much fury.
In the weeks that followed, Galveston's grief gave way to determination. The islanders understood that survival alone was not enough. If the city were to endure, it needed protection from the sea that had nearly erased it overnight. Relief trains arrived from Houston as soon as the damaged bridges were repaired enough to carry supplies. Barrels of fresh water, lumber, and medicine were unloaded at the makeshift docks. Volunteers, including soldiers and engineers, joined the exhausted residents to clear the wreckage. The work was grim, hauling broken timbers, carting away debris, and recovering the last of those lost beneath the ruins. In the city's council halls, some of them little more than tents pitched beside ruined buildings, leaders debated the future. Many businesses had been destroyed, and some merchants considered moving inland to Houston, but a group of prominent citizens insisted that Galveston's harbor, still deep and strategically located, was too valuable to abandon. One key figure in the recovery was civil engineer Henry Martin Robert, later famous for codifying Robert's Rules of Order. He and other experts proposed a bold plan: build a massive seawall along the island's vulnerable Gulf-facing edge, and even more audaciously, raise the entire grade of the city behind it by several feet. Construction of the seawall began in 1902. Huge granite blocks were laid into a sloping barrier stretching miles across the shoreline. Dredges pumped sand from the bay to elevate streets and foundations so that future storm surges would meet a wall of stone and higher ground rather than the low, flat terrain that had surrendered so easily to the hurricane's flood. The project demanded back-breaking labor. Residents watched as entire houses were lifted on jack screws while sand was sluiced beneath them to fill the lowered lots. Wagon teams carried rock from distant quarries. Workmen poured concrete under the blazing Texas sun. Amid the reconstruction, the people of Galveston showed resilience born from shared loss. Families that had once lived as strangers now borrowed tools from each other, cooked meals in common kitchens, and told stories of the night they had survived. Over time, new buildings rose, many of them brick or reinforced wood, standing a little taller and set upon stronger foundations. The rebuilt wharves once again welcomed ships carrying cotton and grain. Slowly, commerce returned. The seawall would grow over the decades to span more than 10 miles, becoming not only a symbol of the city's defense, but also a testament to its resolve. Although Galveston would never fully reclaim the prosperity it had enjoyed before the hurricane, Houston's rise as an inland port changed the region's balance of power. The island remained a community defined by endurance. The survivors honored their dead not only with memorials, but also with stone and engineering, reshaping their city to face the Gulf with new defiance. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, claiming an estimated 8,000 lives. Its destruction did more than alter a city's skyline. It reshaped the nation's understanding of storms and the duty to prepare for them. In the storm's aftermath, the U.S. Weather Bureau faced public outrage. Questions rose in Congress about why Cuban meteorologists' warnings had been disregarded and why residents of Galveston were caught unawares. Investigations revealed flaws in communication.
political mistrust of foreign forecasts, and a failure to grasp how storm surge could devastate a low-lying island. These lessons spurred the modernization of the Weather Bureau's methods. Over the next decades, improvements in telegraph networks, later in radio transmission, and the study of hurricane tracks became priorities. Standardized warning flags were adopted at ports along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, and the Bureau expanded its network of coastal observers. The disaster also changed how Americans thought about coastal development. Urban planners pointed to Galveston as proof that progress and prosperity must be balanced with respect for geography. The massive seawall and grade-raising projects served as early models for engineering solutions in flood-prone regions. Insurance industries, too, reevaluated their risk calculations for seaside properties. Policies grew stricter, and building codes eventually required sturdier foundations and elevated floors for structures near the water. For Galveston's own citizens, the hurricane became part of the island's collective memory. Survivors spoke of it in hushed voices for decades, recalling the sound of the wind and the black water that surged through familiar streets. Parents told their children of the night the sea came ashore so that the next generation would not forget the power of the Gulf. The calamity also left a cultural imprint on Texas. Houston's rise as the state's dominant port was accelerated by Galveston's loss, reshaping trade patterns and migration within the region. Yet the island kept its identity as a place of history and resilience, with the seawall promenade eventually becoming a landmark where tourists could walk while waves rolled harmlessly against the stone barrier below. Each hurricane season that followed carried echoes of 1900. Meteorologists studying storms like the 1935 Labor Day hurricane in the Florida Keys or Hurricane Carla in 1961 often looked back to Galveston's records for guidance. Even in the era of satellites and radar, the story of that storm remains a reminder that human decisions, where to build, when to evacuate, how to heed warnings, can be as crucial as the winds themselves. The tragedy taught that progress is fragile when measured against nature's forces, but also that foresight and collective will can transform vulnerability into resilience. More than a century has passed since that September night, yet the memory of the storm lingers in Galveston like the scent of salt carried on a Gulf breeze. Along the island's shoreline, the great granite seawall stretches for miles, its surface smooth from decades of tides, standing as both sentinel and memorial. Visitors who stroll there at dusk often pause to read plaques honoring those who never saw another sunrise after the hurricane of 1900. On calm evenings, the sea glimmers rose gold beneath the setting sun, the same sea that once surged with lethal force. Children ride bicycles along the promenade while waves slap harmlessly below, their laughter rising above the whisper of the tide. To a casual traveler, it might seem impossible that this gentle beach was ever the stage of so much destruction. For descendants of survivors, however, the island itself is a living archive. Old houses, now sturdier, some raised high on concrete piers, bear brass markers showing how high the waters rose that night. Local museums display weathered photos, streets turned to rivers, families posed beside wrecked wagons, volunteers lifting debris by hand. A faded rope, once used by the Ursuline nuns to bind the orphans together, hangs in a glass case, silent testimony to courage amid terror. Every September, small memorial services are held at the seawall or in historic churches that survived the flood. Bells toll for the thousands lost. Names of known victims are read aloud, while many more remain unnamed, remembered only as part of the great toll recorded in official ledgers. In these ceremonies, Galveston residents are reminded that the hurricane's legacy is not merely a story of ruin, it is a chronicle of endurance. The rebuilding after 1900 laid the groundwork for modern disaster preparedness. The lessons carved in grief helped spare future generations along the Gulf Coast from similar tragedy. As the sun lowers beyond the horizon, the sea grows darker but calmer, the waves folding against the seawall with a soft hiss. Lanterns along the promenade blink on, their glow reflected in the wet stones. The scene feels peaceful, yet beneath it lies the unspoken understanding that nature's strength remains vast and that vigilance must never sleep. The storm of 1900 took thousands, but it also revealed the capacity of communities to rise again. Through engineering feats, shared memory, and annual remembrance, Galveston transformed from victim to survivor, an island shaped as much by human resolve as by wind and tide. And so the waves continue to reach for the shore, as they always have, as they always will, a ceaseless dialogue between land and sea beneath the Gulf's changing sky.